Hi, and welcome to my very first dev vlog for my solo developed game in Unreal Engine, A Little Witchery. This is the game about a cute chibi witch girl who has to travel across the land and bring into balance the four classical elements. At the same time, she learns to love and appreciate her magical abilities she was given at birth that had originally ostracized her from the rest of her townspeople. This is the game that I'm really excited about, and I've already been working on and off for a few weeks now. I have platforming mechanics and a test level done to make sure that they're fun and playable. I also have a basic design and 3D model for our player character Cassie. But don't worry, I have lots of great stuff in store left to make that I'm hoping that I can film, talk over, and show to you people everything that goes into solo developing a game of this scale. So some of the things that I have on my checklist for this week are rigging and animating the Cassie model, as well as importing her into the engine and working with a cell shader to get her a nice, clean Wind Waker toy character look that I think will be at least indicative of the final stylization of the game. I'll also be creating the first real iteration of the spellcasting system. This will be nothing crazy. I won't be actually working with the spells themselves, their environmental effects, or how they'll be used in combat, but I'll be focusing on how the player will actually input their spells that gets processed by the system and then outputs some sort of result. I'm really motivated for this and feel like I have a fairly original idea that I'm just so excited to code and start playing and messing around with in the engine. I'm hoping to get a very flick and swish type feel of casting each gesture within the spell in order to create a sentence of elements that invokes a final form that you cast, if that makes any sense. I don't know if that makes sense. Anyway, you'll be seeing me create this whole thing top to bottom, well, hopefully with a little bit of helpful commentary over top of it. So, with that all said, let's jump right in. So the first thing to do was to make the armature. Now, I actually forgot to record when I was about halfway into it, but where I am right now, I already have the right half of her armature set up, and now I'm setting up the inverse kinematics. This makes it a lot easier when you're doing an animation. Essentially what it is if you can see the bone at the bottom right that I'm kind of moving around right now, what that does is when I move that around, it'll inform the foot bone, the calf bone, and the thigh bone about how to rotate and how to move. So when I'm doing walking animations or anything like that, I just need to rotate and move that bottom inverse bone, and then everything will move along with it. After I have all that set in place, I kind of test to make sure everything's bending as it should, fix a few broken edges here and there, duplicate edges, and then with everything seeming to be animating fine, it's time to move on and actually start keying in some animations. Yeah, so when you're animating, especially if you're more of an amateur at it like I am, definitely wouldn't say I have a lot of animated experience. Using a wax cycle reference was a huge lifesaver for me during this, just so I could have each individual phase. And also while I was doing this, I realized that the skirt was just not deforming as I wanted it to. It's something I didn't catch when I was doing my initial blending testing earlier. And so I added a few extra cuts, loop cuts, just so that instead of just being one little diagonal, horizontal edge, there was 4 to 5, and that really helped it deform a lot smoother and made it act more like a skirt should. Obviously, if this was a higher poly mesh, I'd probably just use a cloth simulation, and I think that I may still move to something like that down the road, but for this mesh, I thought that was perfectly fine. So with the legs looking as I wanted them, I went ahead and started moving on to the arms, which I always find to be a little bit easier. They don't need as many keyframes, just a beginning, a middle, and an end, and then it'll blend smoothly between that. After this, I also worked on a jump and landing animation, which I think I'm gonna cut out and maybe put in later, since I had to redo it almost entirely to get it working correctly with the animation blueprint that I had. And then I moved on after that to the the front flip that she does when air jumping, and I was having so much trouble figuring out how to get this right when I realized I was ignoring the individual origin rotation on Blender. So instead of, when I have every bone selected, rotating it around an average central point, which is good to get her to rotate, as you see now, actually do the front flip and bend over. It wasn't so good in getting her to double over into that kind of fetal position, which once I realized I could do that, it helped so much. So the next step after getting the model and animations ready was to bring Cassie into the engine itself, which means of course saying goodbye to my little beta cylinder. We'll see you later, buddy. You did so well. But of course, trying to bring Cassie into the engine, I ran into an issue where the inverse kinesmatic bones were being identified as multiple root bones by Unreal, and it doesn't like that. It won't let you import something with more than one root bone in the armature. And so I had to go back into Blender, reconnect them to their parent, and then I could import her cleanly into the engine. And thankfully, that didn't really break any of my animations. I was kind of worried it would. I mean, I had to fix them for other reasons, but not because of the root bone. And I was able to move forward. So having had my fill of working on art for a little bit, I decided to switch focus and focus on the more coding side of things. And so I already had a prototype spellcasting system built a few weeks ago. So I'm re-importing that into this new engine and getting it reworking again so I can iterate on it and really create it into something that's even better than it was. So my first change was to make it so you could actually see the wand position. It was invisible before. You had to rely just on the little white indicators turning red to know what element you're invoking, but now I'm going to make it so you can see your one-to-one movement and actually know if you're halfway to this one, or you're at a 45-degree angle or what, and it should make it a little bit easier to control and more intuitive for the player. So with that working, I decided I really would want the players to have to return the wand to the center of the UI in order to cast another gesture. I don't want them to be able to just scroll around the edges of the screen and then just like hit one or two. Each one needs to be a discrete gesture than the other, so I'm just making a little icon so it has to be returned to be recentered. So in my research about traditional witchcraft, Wicca, and ceremonial magic, I uncover that the pentagram really is a powerful symbol that's used in real-life magic, often when invoking elements as well as other types of magic. So I wanted to incorporate into that magic system that I use in the game. And also change of direction meant that I wanted to include the spirit element, mostly because by the way the spells work, by combining different elements. Let's say if you wanted to fire a projectile, that could require putting in the gestures and invoking air twice. And then to make something like a fireball for a fire projectile, you would invoke fire and then air to create the spell. However, that felt a little cumbersome when considering combat. Great for puzzle solving and environmental interactions because it requires you to think through things a little bit more and get creative with what you're using. But if I wanted to give the players something that they could use as a moment's notice, then I thought typing in 3 individual gestures, even if the player got good at them and could do it quickly, was a bit too much to ask, especially at the start of the game. And I thought Spirit could fill that role for me of requiring maybe 1 or 2 gestures to create some sort of basic but useful effect within combat that can be cast at a moment's notice, maybe just 1 gesture or 2 with Spirit to create just a basic Spirit ball or health buff or what have you. And so naturally requiring 5 elements instead of 4 at this point also led to the natural usage of a pentagram instead of a square to graphically visualize the elements. With that as well, I wanted to change a bit how the elements were chosen. Originally, it was based on a metronome system, so similar to the Wind Waker, you would just hover over your mouse on the indicator, and then once the beat struck, that would be entered into the system. I didn't like that so much, and then I switched to a clicking system. And it was all angle based, so it checked to see what angle was being the mouse was from the center, and if it was directly up at 0, that would be whatever was, I think it was air was directly up, and if it was 90 degrees it was water, and 180 degrees earth, and then 270 degrees would be fire. I wanted to make sure that the players actually had to move, all the way off center, select something and move back to center. And so it felt a little bit more natural to use a more collision-based system. I'm not actually using collisions, but I switched to was a radius check. So whenever you move the mouse, it just immediately checks to see if you're in range of any of the elements, and if so, it just selects it for you and adds that to your gesture list and waits for you to recenter the cursor to gesture again and invoke another element. The issues that I was running into was finding a good abstracted way or a variable in order to convey what elements you were selecting to the system so it could process correctly. I was using some really, hacked up ways of using multiple arrays or just hard coding the elements into the system, and none of that felt good and it felt clean. Whenever I made an adjustment, it meant I had to go to each individual usage of that element and change it there. What ended up really, really helping a lot was finally understanding what the struct system and Unreal was for. It allows you to enter into multiple variable types, essentially into the same variable. And since each element had a name and a numerical value associated with them, 0 for spirit, 1 for water, 2 for fire, so on and so forth, it allowed me to check the name of the indicator that you're using, set that as your current element, and then when it was locking that into the gesture list, it could again take the name of the element and use the struct system to find its index and its numerical value, and that is what it would save as a vector. Since it required 3 gestures, it would save each one is XYZ proportion of a vector, and that made it a lot simpler. So now if I ever need to make adjustments, I just need to go back in and only change it within the variable instead of messing with each individual array I had created on the blueprint. The last alteration I made was changing the UI for the lock gestures that you made from being just the directions or the angles that you had entered into actually the classical element symbols. And this should be a much more immersive, since you are it seems like you're putting together, fire, air, air, as opposing to entering left, right, right, and just arrows appearing. I think this is a good change and something that will help cement the overall theming of magic and pagan religions within the game. So having finished up with pretty much all the coding I was planning to do this week, I felt ready to return back to the art side of things and figure out the cell shader that I was going to be using. Thankfully, there was a really awesome shader that's actually free on the Unreal Marketplace, and while I don't think I'm going to use that in the final build, it's a really nice starting point to use and to learn about cell shaders in general. It looked really awful with the grid setup and textures that I have. It made me didn't want to use it at all, but thankfully I had the option to exclude everything but what was enabled in the custom buffer, and so I just enabled the player character. I dragged on 4 different models and applied to them the 2 different shading styles, flat and smooth, as well as the 2 different material styles I had, a lit and unlit, in order to see kind of the full array of what I can do as a cell shader and kind of choose what combination of models and material shading style worked best. I ended up going with a flat shaded model with unlit materials on it, which funnily enough was my original choice before applying the cell shader, but it never hurts to double check and make sure of your choices. Thank you so much for watching. I didn't end up putting everything that I worked on within the video this week, such as the animation blueprint. It's not fully completed, so I think that will be pushed into next week's list, but please, I'd love to get some feedback, so any comments or anything you have, please leave down in the comments below. Maybe I talked too much, maybe I didn't talk enough, maybe I talked about all the boring bits that you didn't want to hear, or maybe I just didn't make any sense. I'd love to hear your feedback and what you thought about this video and how the game is progressing in general. I have a lot of great more stuff planned for the development of this game, and I'm already working on the task list for next week. If you like this video, it means so much if you'd hit that thumbs up and give it a like, or if you'd want to keep watching and stay tuned for how this game develops and progresses, go ahead and subscribe. It'd be a big help to this channel and to motivate me to, finish the game and put the pride in it that it deserves. So thanks again for watching so much, and you guys have a great rest of your week.